Thank you so much. I'm Jean House-Harrell, president of COS, and we're just going to go ahead and bless this food and bless the morning. Father God, thank you so much for your presence here. You are the God of the universe, and we thank you for all you do. Be with us this morning, Father, as we learn more about you through our brother in Christ, Maxwell Su. Father, we pray as a society that you would help us as ophthalmologists to continue to look for you in all that we do, because you are our sufficiency. Thank you for your presence this morning. Bless this food, Father, that may nourish our bodies. In Jesus' name, amen. So, I wanted to just start with a couple of informational items here. So on your tables soon, we have our annual meeting, Christian Ophthalmology annual meeting. It's in St. Paul, Minnesota. Mall of America is up there, but there's just a ton of family stuff to do there as well. We're a family-oriented society. 501c3, and we welcome medical students who are interested in ophthalmology. We even have exhibitors who are Jesus followers. What unites us is, as ophthalmologists and ophthalmology residents, is we are Jesus followers. And so that's kind of what we're doing with that. But our 47th annual meeting, we have 19.5 CME hours, including some CME, and we have great speakers lined up for you, so it should be a fun event. We do give you some free time, so it's not totally lots and lots of work. On your tables, we also, because we're 501c3, we would welcome any donations to the society. That's in this envelope. You can also just go to the website if you prefer that way. If you didn't sign in this morning, please do that, because we'd like to have just information that you were here and know that and follow up with you. So on your tables is, I'm a QR code queen, it's an annual meeting registration, the one I just showed you. And Max is just very dynamic. We would love to have you join us. We gather together. We have small prayer groups. We have a women's group. We have medical student residency kind of groups. We have a lot of missionary type work that we do, a whole lot, globally and locally. So we're very happy to have you with us. And then we 2 years ago started this foster missionary program, and it's just taken off. God is good. And so we blessed, as a society, the Hoffman family. Wendy is a U.S. trained ophthalmic surgeon who, she and her 3 little children and her husband Eric set themselves up under God's sovereign way in Gabon, which is in West Africa. And they went to language school to learn French, and so they lived there. And so we blessed them, because in the middle of the jungle they didn't have many things, and used equipment with no replacement parts or warranties or anything. So we as a society decided to take on one missionary every couple of years. So that situation is also, it's called FAM, or Foster a Missionary, is what the acronym stands for. And so we're delighted to do that. So if those sorts of things interest you, I think it would be awesome to have you join us as well. Joining me in welcoming this morning, Dr. Maxwell Su. He is our speaker this morning. You'll find him engaging, enthusiastic, energetic in his delivery. I put a QR code on your table. We'll put one up on the last slide too, so if you want to take a picture of that and get your CME. We'd also like your feedback as well. Max practices comprehensive ophthalmology in Palestine, Texas at the Gold Eye Clinic. His undergraduate and doctoral medicine degrees both came from Texas A&M in Temple, Texas. After that, his ophthalmology residency and chief residency were completed at Baylor Scott and White at the Eye Institute. And there he has But I'm sure he will mention his amazing wife and children because they are part of Team Max. You'll find he's very passionate about glorifying God by helping others, which all started back in high school with exposure to both local and international missions. So since then, he's very much strived to help with humanitarian, medical, and ophthalmic relief worldwide. On behalf of the Christian Ophthalmology Society, it's my distinct pleasure to
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that awesome introduction, Gene. And I will say that a lot of y'all know here at Blindness. I think it's just a very, very unique group of people, and I found it out of my community, and so I'm very, very, very thankful that I can see you for members in Situation Class, and we get to just kind of worship God together this morning. So, my presentation, the title is God's Perspective on Our Performance, an Eastern View of the Western Workplace. And I just want to thank Gene for giving me this opportunity because I often tell my wife, Rachel, that, Rachel, you don't have to convince me that Jesus is better. I believe that. But what you do have to do is remind me. And I'm so prone to forgetting that. And so I need to be reminded. And so just even putting together this talk has reminded me about something very pivotal and very, very dynamic about our God. And something that I hope to share with you guys. And so, let's get started. So, no financial disclosures, unfortunately. My objectives this morning are to provide examples of paradigms in medicine in relation to spiritual blindness, give an overview of the perceptions of performance in the medical workplace, give an overview of God's perception of our performance, express an understanding of God's requirement of us, and explain why incorporating God's perspective is important to the physician. So, Gene gave me the topic of spiritual blindness, and whenever I think about spiritual blindness, I can't help but think about spiritual vision, because my thought is that spiritual blindness is just the lack thereof. And so when I think about spiritual vision, the first thing that comes to mind is this paradigm in which we view God, the world, our circumstances, and others, right? It's this outward approach, it's this narrative of how we navigate this life that we live in. But another way to think about spiritual vision is this introspective view on ourselves, right? This paradigm in which we view ourselves. When I look in the mirror, who is Max Su? And a lot of times, when I view myself, when I look at myself, it is so deeply tied to my performance. And I don't know if anyone can relate to that. I would assume so, because we're all achievers, we all got here somehow, and it's probably because of our performance. We want to perform, and to some degree that's good, but I'll tell you this, I want to focus this morning on my perception of myself, my spiritual vision when I look at myself. And again, because it's so tied to performance, at least for me, and specifically in two ways. The first way is the way that others perceive me. Whether I admit it, acknowledge it or not, I am obsessed with the way that others perceive me. Am I working good enough for my boss? Am I providing enough for my clinic? Am I contributing enough? Does my wife, if you my kids, they look at me and say, does Dad provide well enough for me? I think about the way that others perceive performance. And then the second way is I always perceive the way that I think about my own performance. Is Max Su contributing to his clinic enough? Is Max Su doing enough surgeries? Is Max Su seeing enough clinic patients? Is he providing for his family enough? So the way that others perceive me in regards to my performance, and then the way that I perceive myself in regards to performance. The third way is something that I do not think about often enough, and that is God's perception of me. What does God think about the way that I perform? And I think that going through this, looking at a couple of here, and this is just to kind of set a little bit of groundwork, but I see that in a lot of papers that we're all pretty happy people as ophthalmologists. And we have some papers that show that overall 88% of ophthalmologists were satisfied with their job. And a lot of that satisfaction, I think, is tied very closely to this concept of performance. Some papers show that 55% of these happy ophthalmologists, however, were dissatisfied with their income. And the only reason I bring income to the story is because, I don't know about you, but for me, a lot of times income is also so tied together with performance, right? It's a way that I gauge my performance a lot of times. Now, even though that papers have shown that most ophthalmologists are very happy people, we've also seen up to 40% reported burnout rate in ophthalmology. And out of this 40%, unfortunately, only 23% of those ophthalmologists will even seek professional help for it. So we have this idea of job satisfaction tied to performance. And whenever we're so obsessed with performance, that can potentially lead to burnout. And burnout can potentially lead to consequences. One paper shows these three very obvious consequences: a deterioration in physical and mental health, negative impact on productivity, and very, very obvious. But I want to make this argument of this rat race of production that I, at least for myself, am positive. And so I also want to say this: a lot of what I'm saying to you guys this morning, I'm actually saying to myself, because I remind myself of this. But this rat race of production where we just keep going, we keep churning, we keep producing, we keep impressing, we keep showing up, trying to be the person that we think that we need to be. And for me, in the past, even now, what that has looked like is more papers published, more accolades, more speaking engagements, more reviews, more surveys, more sales, meeting quota, exceeding quota, more production. And what I want to show here is that our job satisfaction can be tied to our performance. And our need for performance can lead to burnout. Burnout can clearly lead to consequences. But my argument here is that perhaps the most important consequence is a spiritual blindness in how we perceive ourselves. And so that's the groundwork here. And before we dive into just the crux, the meat of what I want to communicate to you guys this morning is I want to give a few acknowledgments. And the reason for that is because, as you'll see, I borrow extremely heavy from these four sources. I have no intention to plagiarize or call something mine that's not mine. A lot of what I'm going to be saying, it comes from teachings of incredible Bible scholars, and I even quote some of them verbatim. And so I just want to lay that out there first and foremost. So Marty Solomon, he has two great ministries, Bema Discipleship and Impact Campus Ministries. His partner, Brent Billings, they are Bible scholars. And then Rabbi David Foreman, if you've ever seen his work, his ministry is Aleph Beta, and he portrays the Torah from a Jewish perspective in a lot of videos. And then, of course, my trusty ESV Crossway Study Bible. I borrow a lot from the commentaries there. And so I'm excited about this. So I want to talk about the creation story. So this is Genesis 1 through 2 through 3. And I've read the creation story so many times. I've seen it on felt boards as a kid, but the more and more I read it, I see that it is truly this beautiful work of literature. It is a beautiful work of art that communicates something so deep and so dynamic that gives us a good idea of who we are, but specifically who we are in God. And so I thought we could start this morning by just reading this together. So I'm going to read it for you guys, and y'all can just follow along. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and he separated light from darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and gathered the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate day from night, and let them serve as signs to mark the sacred times, the days, the years. And let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so.
God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, let the water teem with living creatures and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which water teems and that moves about in it according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the water in the seas and let the birds increase on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, the wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. The image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move on the ground, everything that has breath in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. Whew. Now, before we analyze this creation story, this poem, and as I read it, hopefully you can see that it is a poem, and many commentators will comment that this is a poem, and some call it a Sumerian poem, some call it a Mesopotamian style of poetry, but either way, many people call this actually a poem. So before we analyze this poem, I want to go through a couple of concepts. We must first remember that this is Hebrew literature written for a Hebrew audience. And there's this difference between Western and Eastern learning. And so Easterners don't teach the way that Westerners do. Westerners like to teach by making a point and then give supporting evidence as a proof that supporting information. They give the logic, they give the reasoning of their point, very much like what I'm doing right now. This is a transfer of information. However, the Easterner has a fundamental belief that true learning doesn't just happen with the transfer of information. Rather, true learning happens because you discover a new truth. But an Easterner has a way to do that, and that art of discovery is everything to the Easterner, which means that when they write their stories, somewhere in the story, the author wants you to discover something. And it's not going to be super obvious, right? So it's not going to be blinking, or it's not going to be in bold letters, but it's going to be something hidden within the story, because the author, the Eastern author, wants to lead you in a journey of discovery. And they had all these methods, and they had all these literary tools that they would use to accomplish the process of discovery. Some pictures and images were as simple as poetry. And so when I entered college as a freshman, I actually entered as an English major with an emphasis in creative writing. And so I'm no expert by any means, but I do love when I see good poetry. And good poetry, as I was taught, always has a cadence and a rhythm to it. And one way that poetry does that is with the refrains. And so we see these refrains over and over in the creation story. We see that it was good, it was good, it was good, it was very good. And then we see the refrain of there was evening and there was morning, there was evening and there was morning. And that creates a cadence and a rhythm to kind of tie the story together. This is an incredibly well put together piece of literature. And what I'm trying to tell you this morning is that it's not just a scientific lab report. It's not simply about how God created the world or 7 literal days or 24-hour periods, but it's about something far wider and far deeper. It's about the nature of God. It's about the nature of his creation, the world, and most importantly, it's about the nature of man. So let's kind of dive into this, and I want to kind of explain to you why this looks like poetry to me. And so in poetry, and the repetitive patterns help to bring the story together, to tie it together. So in this creation story, we see patterns of the number 3. There are 3 days of creation mirrored by 3 days of creation, and then God rests. And I'm going to unpack that for you a little bit, in just a little bit here. There's a 3-ness about the Creator. In Genesis 1, the Creator is described by the word bara, the Hebrew word for create. So this God is a creator. We also see him described as spirit. He's spirit. And then we also see him described as word. This is corroborated in John 1 as he speaks the creation into being. So there's a 3-ness about this creator: bara, spirit, and word. This word bara, this Hebrew word for create, also appears 3 times in this creation story. It appears in the beginning, it appears in the middle, and then it appears at the end. And when it appears at the end, it appears 3 times in rapid succession. So we have these patterns of 3s. And then we have these patterns of 7s. The first verse in the Hebrew has 7 words in it, so 7 times 1. The second verse in the Hebrew has 14 words in it, 7 times 2. The 7th verse has 35 words in it in the Hebrew, 7 times 5. The word God is mentioned 35 times, so 7 times 5. The phrase "it was so" appears 7 times in this poem. The phrase "and God saw" appears 7 times in this poem. So we have these patterns of 3s, we have these patterns of 7s, and it might be silly or perhaps even far-reaching to say, but if there's 3s and 7s, then perhaps there are these patterns of 10s. And we see the phrase "to make," which appears 10 times in the poem. The phrase "according to its kind" appears 10 times in the poem. The phrase "and God said" occurs 10 times in the poem, 3 times in reference to people, 7 times in reference to creatures. The phrase "let there be" occurs 10 times in this poem, 3 times in reference to things in heaven, 7 times in reference to things on earth. This poem is full of patterns: 3s, 7s, 10s. It is not a scientific lab report. It is not a lab report. It is not a lab report. What I'm trying to tell you is God created the world, but there is a deeper meaning. And this meaning of why he wants to project this creation story upon us can be found in this literally tool of this tool of a chiasm. And if you look throughout Genesis from the beginning to the end, it's full of all these chiasms. Well, so what is a chiasm? A chiasm is a tool that they would use. A chiasm means that the first part of the story mirrors the last part of the story. So a couple pattern examples are ABC, CBA, or ABC, ABC. But what you'll notice is that everything is driven to the center. A better way to look at this is with some visuals here. So a chiasm can be shaped like an hourglass, larger, and then it becomes smaller again. Or, if you look on the right in the red, it can be themes that repeat consecutively. So ABC, ABC in that pattern. But however, what I want you to see is that all of these chiasms will have a central point. So let's apply this to what we're seeing in the creation story. So I've kind of outlined the creation story for you here. The first 7 days, again, 3 days of creation separated by 3 days of creation. So before I do that, let's just step back. So let's just say that we want to view this as a lab report. Let's just say that we want to view this as an order of operations. This is the chronological order of how God created the world. And I think when we do that, we run into all sorts of problems. I'll give you just a few examples. First of all, you see that the plants are created on day 3, the day of separating land from the sea. Now the sun, however, is not created until day 4, but the plants can't really be created without the sun, or at least logically, the plants can't be created without the source of created by days. You'll see that day 1, based off of the text, especially in the Hebrew, the NIV does and then you see that day 2 is this mommy paragraph, and daddy's smaller again. So then you have another baby, or a nice diamond pattern of the slides. Day 6 is not a baby paragraph. Intrusion in the story. It gets smaller as you're going through it, and then all from that, the creation story BC. And so again, visually, the best way to find a bookends. And then you can work the objective of Now the earth was formless and empty. The earth was formless and empty. It was nothing. There was nothing there. It was a blank white screen like this. And then how does the story end? The story ends on day 7. Doing nothing. And you actually count the literal right there in the middle of the poem. And that Hebrew word is seasons. It shows up right where you think it would. So if you think that there's 7 days of creation, then you would assume that the moon, the star, the NIV, which is what I have here, translates about Sabbath, which is exactly what God. And if you've ever wondered why this concept of Sabbath is so important to the Jewish people, so Moad. Well, let's think about this Genesis, this creation story in context. Who is hearing this story for the first time? They're in the wilderness. And why were they in the desert, in the wilderness? Or another way to ask that is, they're in Egypt. They were slaves. They made bricks. Slave who is hearing this story for the first time. So put ourselves in their shoes, or I guess their sandals. So for the last over 400 years, Egypt has told you for over 4 centuries that your value and your worth is tied up in how many bricks that you can produce. The only reason that you have any worth to the Egyptian empire is how many bricks you can make. And so let's just take this from a practical situation. So say if you rebel against that theology or that narrative that Egypt is putting, you are a leech consuming resources. And if the empire takes you out of the equation, you can't protect your family. I think we all know what the empire is going to do to your wives and your daughters if you're only as valuable as how many bricks you can make. As how many bricks you can make. Does that sound familiar? As how much I can produce. Israelites who have been caught up in to take does not come from what you produce. Further, the creation of mankind, if you remember, sat out as a protrusion in this story. This beautiful diamond chiasm is coming to a point, and then boom, the creation of man. It's almost as if the author is sticking it out there on purpose, trying to let us know that we are the crowning moment of God's good creation. And isn't it interesting that God calls everything good? It's good, it's good, until the creation of man, where he says, it is very good. It is not until the creation of man where he says it is very good. It's almost like that is the summation of all of his creation. I am done. It is complete. And I think that God is, what he's trying to do is he's trying to ask us to just trust him. Trust the story. Trust that God made you, that he loves you, that he is proud of you for you. There's nothing else that he needs to do for us or that we need to do. He made us, and it was very good. Rabbi David Foreman has this wonderful illustration of the sculpture of David by Michelangelo. If y'all have ever seen that, it is phenomenal. It is perfect. And even if you've seen photos of it, how did he do that? How did a human being do that with a chisel and a hammer? The illustration is that at some point, Michelangelo had to just step back and say, I need to put down my chisel. I need to put down my hammer. If I take one more swing at this thing, it's going to ruin it. It's done. It's perfect. I think that's how God sees us. His treasure for us is to rest in that fact. Resting in the fact that our value and our worth does not come from what we produce, but it comes from who we are. I want to revisit, and I think it's one thing that gives in rhythm and ties this story together. It was evening, it was morning the first day. It was evening, it was morning the second day, and so on, all the way throughout the 6th day. But notice, there is no refrain, it was evening and it was morning the 7th day. It's as if the author is deliberately just hanging the 7th day out there endlessly with no refrain, no cap. The 7th day goes on forever and ever because it's God's invitation to you and I to trust the story, of rest. And Marty Solomon does a great job of explaining this and how we are just stuck in this culture that is all wound up in the Egyptian narrative. Right? It's all wound up in production of whether I'm good enough, I'm skinny enough, I'm smart enough, I have enough possessions, if I can impress the right people, if I have the right degree, if I'm in the right career. We are slaves to the system of brick making, the system of production, because we keep going and we keep churning and we keep producing and we keep impressing and we keep trying to show up to be the person we think that we need to be. And God is resting, and he says to us, you just need to know how to stop. you need to know how to Sabbath. Join me in the seventh day that goes on forever and ever and ever. You are invited at all times, all places, right now, to trust me in that my creation is good enough. Will you just trust me? And one more thing I want to do with this refrain here is that if we go back to this Egyptian narrative, and you're an Egyptian slave, how many days a week did you work? You worked 7 days a week. There was no weekend. And what were your hours? Did you get every other Friday off? Did you have a late start on some Thursdays? No, it was sun up to sundown. Sun up to sundown. The Egyptian narrative, the refrain there is sun up to sundown, sun up to sundown. Does that sound familiar? I mean, I can't tell you how many times that I've woken myself up at 5 a.m. with no alarm because I'm thinking about a patient or a surgery that I have to do or whatever it is. Or maybe the first thing that I do when I woke up is I feel for my phone and I start scrolling through my emails and thinking about the list of things that I have to do. I mean, that sounds familiar to me. But look at this refrain of evening and there was morning. When I first read that, I was like, that's weird. That's backwards. That does not match up to my day. My day starts in the morning and it ends in the evening. But I'll tell you this, a Jewish reader would have no qualms with this refrain. They would read it and move on because when does the Jewish day start? A good way to think about it is, when does Shabbat start? Shabbat starts Friday at sundown. It starts sundown, and then it goes until Saturday at sundown. The Jewish day starts at sundown. How contrary is that to us? The Jewish teach that this is always a reminder that your day does not begin with production. Your day does not begin with production. It doesn't begin with getting out of bed and thinking about the hundreds of things that you have to do. Your day begins with resting. The first thing that you do in a Jewish world is you go to bed. You go to bed. The first thing you do the first thing that you do when you get up, or the first thing that you do to start your day, is rest, because your identity lies in who you are created by God to be and not what you do. So why evening and morning? Because that's how a day operates in God's economy. I like to think that, I just imagine God's talking to us and he says, hey Max, have you seen the Aurora Borealis? It is beautiful. It is magical. It's also almost mystical. You can't explain it. It is amazing. Yeah, I created that. It's good. Have you seen the Swiss Alps? Have you climbed the Swiss Alps? They are majestic. It's breathtaking. The view is unlike any other. I created that. It's good. Have you seen the valleys of Kauai, the lush greenery that just borders the white sands and the ocean that then just goes on as far as the eye can see? There's nothing like that. Yeah, I created that, and it's good. And then he says to me, whenever you are asleep, whenever you are resting, doing nothing, whenever you are unconscious, you are the crowning glory of my creation. Because compared to all of those other things, you are very good. God's economy is not based off of our production. God's economy is based off of his good creation. You are not valuable because of your ability to make bricks. You are valuable because you are the crowning moment of God's good creation. And so, to close, I just want to close with one more chiasm. And this is, you won't find this in any commentary. This is a chiasm of my own creation. It's not really a true chiasm, but I just want to illustrate one last point here to take this home. So in Genesis 1, 2 through 3, we see the creation story. The creation story is a call to rest, this moad, because you are loved, because you are enough, because you are very good. And then at the end of this huge narrative, the story that God wants to give us, we have Revelations 4:11. And the context here is that you have all these beings encircling the throne of God and just worshiping him, worshiping him. And one of them says, "Worthy are you, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created." By your will they existed and were created. We were created by his will. So now we have these two bookends of this love of God, of him telling us that we are created for him in his image, and he imbues our identity, pointing towards the center. And again, this is not a true chiasm, but I come to the book of Mark. And in Mark 2, there's one of my favorite stories in the whole Bible. In Mark 2, Mark tells us about a paralytic man. And honestly, Mark doesn't give us much information about this paralytic man, so I have to kind of just fill in the gaps with my own imagination. And so I imagine that there's this paralytic man, and I imagine that he's been paralytic since he was a child. Mark does tell us that he does have some good friends, though. So I imagine that he has some childhood friends that he's grown up with. And I imagine that as a paralytic, he's watching his friends run around, play, climb trees, play sports, do all these things that he cannot do. And so even as a child, this narrative begins to happen in his heart and his mind. This narrative of, I can't do that. I'm not good enough. I'm unable. And then I imagine that they grow up and become teenagers, and the teenagers are starting to apprentice with their fathers, fishermen, blacksmith, whatever it is, or they're traveling to learn the Torah. And he says, I can't travel to do that. I can't stand up to be a fisherman. I can't climb in a boat. I can't. And then as these men grow up and become adults, they're now working and providing for their family. They're producing and providing. And this narrative become ingrained in his heart because of years and years and years of this identity of, I can't. I'm not good enough. I can't produce. I can't bring home anything to the family. And we have to imagine this guy, too. If he's a paralytic, then he probably spends most of his time begging for food. I think that he might not even be able to go to the bathroom on his own. And so this guy lives in a constant state of humiliation that has become his identity. His identity is, I can't, I'm not good enough, I'm unworthy, humiliation, shame. And then Mark tells us that one day there's this healer, this teacher that's coming to town. And there's this huge uproar about this healer and this teacher. And his friends rush up to this paralytic man. They're like, hey, look, there's this healer that's coming to town. We got to take you to him. Maybe he can do something for you. And the paralytic's like, guys, no, come on. We've done this so many times. You know, we've been to every single healer, every single doctor. No one can fix me. This is who I am. And they're trying to convince him. And he's just not budging. And then I have to imagine his friends are like, well, there's really nothing that you can do about it. So they just pick him up and they bring him to this house where this famous healer and teacher is preaching that day. And they're telling this guy on the way, like, look, trust us. This guy has done things and said things that no one else has done or said before. The blind are seeing, the deaf are hearing. We've got to try. And they get to this house, and to their dismay, the house is just packed. It's brimming with people. There's people sitting in the windowsills. There's people in the front yard. It is just packed. There's no way they're going to get into this house. And so they think to themselves, we're not going to be dismayed. And so they climb onto the roof, they rip open the shingles, and they lower this man into the house. And now I have to imagine that the roof opens up and there's this literal spotlight on this man as he's being lowered into the house. And I just imagine this crowded house starts to part ways and open up the floor for him, and he's plopped right there on the floor in front of this famous healer and teacher. And if he's ever been humiliated in his life, he has never been humiliated to this degree. And I imagine that the town scribes, the high priests, all of these big town officials are there, and they see this man, they know who this is, and they start muttering to themselves, oh my goodness, what is this guy doing here? He is ruining this whole event. Oh my gosh. And more than ever, this man is just mortified in his shame. And more than ever, thoughts go through his mind of worthless, unable, I can't, not good enough, ashamed. And I have to imagine that there's this spark of curiosity that just goes off in his heart, and he just has to know who this healer, who this teacher is. And so he builds up the courage to look up, and as he looks up, he's not just looking into the face of just some healer or some teacher, but he is looking into the face of the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the great I am. He is looking into the face of Jesus Christ. And what Mark tells us is that before Jesus does anything, before Jesus heals this man, before Jesus says anything at all, Jesus says, my son. And in that moment, he claims that man as his very own. In front of everybody in the town, he says, this is my son. He is a prince in the kingdom of heaven. He is the crowning glory of my creation. That is who he is. No longer are you called unworthy or not good enough or unable, but you are my son. So when we think about spiritual vision, and when we think about spiritual vision in the way that we perceive ourselves, forget how others perceive us. When we perceive ourselves, are you seeing yourself through this Egyptian narrative that you are worthy only because of what you can produce? Or are you seeing yourself through God's narrative? You are worthy because he says you are worthy. Trust him because he says that you are enough and you are very good. Trust him because he is who he says, and we are who he says we are. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you. Have a great day, everyone. We'll see you in June at our annual meeting in St. Paul. For your CME, just take a photograph of that QR code, and there you have it, and we'll ask you a little survey as well. Yes.